One moment, she was humming along to something on the radio in the kitchen, and the next moment she wasn't. That's how fast it happens. That's how fast 61 years of a life, a good life, a full life, can just stop. My wife Dorothy collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Right there, on the hardwood floor, she'd refinished herself 3 summers ago. The paramedics said it was a massive cardiac event. They said she likely didn't feel anything. I've spent the better part of 8 months trying to believe that. We had been married for 5 years. Just 5 years. And I know what some people think when they hear that. They think not long enough to count, not long enough to matter. Her son thought exactly that. Before we continue, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. I always love knowing who's out there listening. Dorothy and I met at a community center in Guelph, Ontario. She was teaching a watercolor class on Wednesday evenings, and my neighbor dragged me along because she thought I needed to get out of the house. She was right. I'd been a widower for 3 years at that point. My first wife, Patricia, had passed from lung cancer, and I'd spent most of those 3 years eating frozen dinners and watching too much hockey. I walked into that community center not expecting anything, and Dorothy handed me a brush and told me to stop overthinking the water and just let my hand move. I was terrible at painting. I'm still terrible, but I showed up every Wednesday for 4 months, and eventually I stopped coming for the painting. Dorothy had 2 children from her first marriage. Her daughter, Rebecca, lived out in Kelowna, and we got along well enough polite at Christmas. Friendly phone calls when Dorothy's birthday came around. But her son, Trevor, was a different matter from the beginning. Trevor was 43 years old, worked in commercial real estate in Mississauga, and had his mother's same sharp blue eyes without any of her warmth behind them. The first time I met him, at a barbecue Dorothy organized that summer, he shook my hand and smiled, and then spent the rest of the afternoon watching me the way you watch someone you've already decided not to trust. Dorothy noticed. She always noticed. On the drive home, she reached over and put her hand on mine and said, "Give him time." So I did. I gave him 2 years. And Trevor gave me nothing back but a cold shoulder and a tighter grip on his mother every time we were all in the same room. When Dorothy and I got married at the registry office in downtown Guelph, just us and 2 friends as witnesses, nothing big, the way we both wanted it. Trevor didn't come. He said he had a work conflict. Dorothy smiled when she told me, but I could see it cost her something. We were happy. Though, I want to make sure I say that clearly, because what comes later could make you forget it. We were genuinely, quietly, deeply happy. We spent our summers driving the back roads of Ontario, stopping at farm stands and small-town diners. We drove out to Tofino one September and walked the beach in the rain. We had a routine that felt like a gift, coffee on the back porch in the mornings, the newspaper, her painting in the afternoon, me in the garden. Simple things. The kind of simple things that are actually everything. Dorothy owned the house outright. It was a 3-bedroom on a wide lot in a good neighborhood in Guelph, and she'd lived there for 20 years. She also had savings from the sale of her late mother's property in Prince Edward County, a modest investment portfolio. Nothing extravagant, but comfortable. When we married, I moved in. I had my own savings from my working years. I'd been an electrician for 32 years, and I contributed to the household and to our life together. But the house was hers. The investments were hers. I never once thought of them as mine. That Tuesday in October, I found her on the kitchen floor at just after 2 in the afternoon. I called 911. I rode in the ambulance. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 40 minutes before a doctor came and sat down across from me with that particular stillness that tells you everything before a word is spoken. Trevor arrived at the hospital before Rebecca did. He lived closer. He walked past me in the waiting room, the way you walk past a stranger. went straight to the nurse's station, and identified himself as Dorothy's son. I stood up and said his name. He turned and looked at me, and there was something in his face, grief. Yes, but underneath it something else already forming, something calculating, and he said, "We'll talk later." We talked later. It was 3 days after the funeral. Rebecca had flown back to Kelowna the day before. Trevor came to the house, my house, the house I had lived in for 5 years, to the house where I still had Dorothy's handwriting on a grocery list, stuck to the refrigerator, and he sat down at the kitchen table like he owned it. His wife, Sandra, sat beside him. Sandra had always been friendly enough at family gatherings. But that afternoon she had a folder in front of her and a look on her face that told me the friendliness was a seasonal thing. Trevor folded his hands on the table and said, "I want to talk about the property." I said I was listening. He said that the house had been in his mother's family. Essentially, that she had bought it before their marriage, with money she'd accumulated over a lifetime, that my contribution to it had been minimal. He used the word minimal carefully, the way people use words when they've rehearsed them. He said that given the length of our marriage, 5 years, he said, with a particular emphasis, as if the number itself was an argument, he felt it was reasonable for me to understand that the house and Dorothy's estate should pass to her children. I asked him what he was proposing. Sandra slid the folder across the table. Inside was a document prepared by a paralegal. It outlined an offer I would receive $175. 000 from Dorothy's estate, a sum Trevor described as generous and reflective of my limited contribution, and in exchange I would vacate the property within 60 days and sign over any spousal claim to the estate. The document used a lot of formal language, but the meaning was plain enough. He was offering me money to disappear. I looked at the document for a while. I looked at the grocery list on the fridge. I thought about Dorothy telling me to stop overthinking the water. Trevor said, "I think you know this is fair." I said I would need some time to think about it. He said he would give me 2 weeks. I want to tell you what I felt in those 2 weeks, because I think it matters. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. There was something that passed through me, like anger. Yes. In the first couple of days, I'd lie awake at night running through everything I wanted to say to Trevor, all the arguments, all the evidence of what I'd contributed, all the years I'd spent loving his mother well. I constructed entire speeches in my head. I won every argument at 2 in the morning, but something happened around the 4th or 5th day. I was sitting on the back porch with my coffee, in the spot where Dorothy and I had sat every morning for 5 years. And I thought she knew him. She had known exactly who her son was for 43 years. She was a careful woman, a precise woman. She signed every form twice, kept copies of everything, never left a thing to chance. She had known what Trevor was capable of, and she had loved me clearly enough that she would have thought about this. I called my own lawyer that afternoon. Not to fight. I want to be clear about that. I called her because I had questions, and because Dorothy had always said you should ask questions before you make decisions. My lawyer's name is Margaret Osei. She's been practicing family and estate law in Guelph for over 20 years. And when I explained the situation, she was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Did Dorothy have a will?" I told her that yes. Dorothy had a will, that she had updated it approximately 14 months before she died. That I had known about it in general terms, but had never read it in detail, because it had seemed morbid to ask. Margaret said, "I think you should come in." I went in the next morning. I won't tell you what was in that will yet, not because I want to be dramatic about it, but because I think you need to understand what happened first, what I decided, and why before the ending means anything. I went back to Trevor with my answer 1 week after he'd given me the folder. I called him. "Note, Sandra. and I asked him to come to the house. He came alone this time. He sat at the same kitchen table with his hands folded the same way. And I told him that I had decided to accept his offer. He blinked. Just once. But I caught it. He hadn't expected that. I told him I had no interest in fighting. That I had loved his mother, and that fighting over her belongings in a courtroom felt like a way of undoing something I didn't want undone. I told him that if $175,000 was what he believed I deserved, I was willing to sit with that. I told him I would sign the documents. He said, That's the right choice. There was something in the way he said it. Relief. But also a loosening. The way people loosen when they realize they've gotten away with something. He pulled out his phone immediately and started typing a message. Presumably to Sandra or the paralegal or whoever was waiting on the other end. I asked him one thing before he left. I asked him to make sure that whatever legal process came next included a meeting with Dorothy's estate solicitor, a woman named Claire Bergeron, whose office was in downtown Guelph. Trevor said that was standard procedure anyway. I said, good. We met in Claire's office on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November. The maple trees on the street outside had gone bare by then, and there was that flat gray light that settles over Ontario in the fall and doesn't lift until April. Trevor and Sandra were there. I was there with Margaret Osei. Claire Bergeron sat at the head of the table with Dorothy's file in front of her. Trevor had brought the documents for me to sign the spousal release, the agreement to vacate, the $175,000 settlement. He had them paper-clipped together in a neat stack, and he set them in front of me with the confidence of someone who has already spent the money in his head. Claire Bergeron cleared her throat. She said that before any documents were signed, she needed to read the relevant provisions of Dorothy's will into the record, as was standard practice. Trevor nodded like this was a formality. Sandra uncapped her pen. Claire opened the file. She read the standard sections. First, the executor designation, which was Rebecca, the confirmation of assets. Trevor was leaning back slightly in his chair. Sandra had written something in the margin of one of her papers. And then Claire read one paragraph. I will try to give you the essence of it without getting lost in the legal language. Dorothy had included a clause, apparently not uncommon in estate planning, though I hadn't known about it, that addressed what lawyers call undue influence. The clause stated that if any beneficiary, or the spouse or partner of any beneficiary, was found to have applied pressure, made financial offers, or taken legal steps to compel the surviving spouse to relinquish spousal rights to the estate prior to the estate being settled through proper probate proceedings, then that beneficiary would be considered to have acted against the expressed wishes of the deceased and would be removed from the estate entirely. There was a secondary clause. It stated that if the surviving spouse, under such circumstances, agreed to sign away any rights, that agreement would be considered void, having been obtained under duress, and the full spousal entitlement would be restored automatically. Claire set down the document. The room was quiet for long enough that I could hear the traffic on the street outside. Trevor's face had gone a particular color, not quite white, more like the color of old snow. Sandra had stopped writing. The pen was still in her hand, but it wasn't moving. Trevor said, "What does that mean?" It wasn't really a question. It was the sound a person makes when they already know the answer and they're hoping that saying words out loud will change it. Claire explained it plainly. The offer Trevor had made, the documents he had prepared, the pressure applied 3 days after Dorothy's funeral, all of it had triggered the clause. Not only was my spousal entitlement fully restored, but Trevor had, by the clear definition in the will, acted against Dorothy's expressed wishes. His share of the estate, which had been one half, with the other half to Rebecca, was now void. Sandra said. That can't be enforceable. Margaret Ozai, who had been quiet through all of it, said that it was enforceable, that it was a legitimately constructed provision, and that she would be happy to explain the relevant Ontario case law, if that would be helpful. Sandra looked at Trevor. Trevor was staring at the table. I want to tell you something about that moment, because I think people sometimes imagine that justice feels like winning, like a prize, or a score going up on a board. It didn't feel like that. What I felt, sitting in that chair in Claire Bergeron's office, while the maple trees stood bare outside the window, was something quieter than victory. It felt like being recognized, like Dorothy, from wherever she was, had looked up from her watercolors and said, I see you. I always saw you. I had not known about the clause. I want to say that plainly. I had not known when I agreed to sign Trevor's documents. I had not been strategic or clever. I had genuinely meant it when I told Trevor I didn't want to fight. I was 64 years old, and I had just lost my wife, and fighting was the last thing I had the heart for. It turned out Dorothy had done the fighting for me, long before I needed it. 14 months before she died, she had sat in that same chair across from Claire Bergeron and thought through every scenario with the precision she brought to everything. And she had made sure that's who she was. That's who I had the privilege of being loved by for 5 years. The meeting ended without anyone signing anything except some standard estate administration forms. Trevor and Sandra left without speaking to me. I heard from Margaret a few weeks later that Trevor had consulted his own lawyer about contesting the clause and had been advised it wasn't worth pursuing. Rebecca, when she was told the full story by Claire Bergeron, called me from Kelowna and cried for 20 minutes and apologized for her brother and said that her mother had always known exactly what she was doing. I still live in the house. The grocery list is still on the refrigerator. I'll probably never throw it out. I went back to the community center in January. The Wednesday watercolor class. A new instructor now. A young woman named Priya, who is patient with beginners. I'm still terrible at painting. Dorothy always said I held the brush too tightly, that the secret was to let go a little and trust the hand. I'm working on it. I kept thinking, in those months, after everything settled, about why Dorothy had done what she did. Not the legal mechanics of it, I understood those well enough, but the why of the choice. She could have simply written a will that left everything to me directly and let Trevor contest it if he wanted to. She could have told me about the clause so I'd know it was there. She did neither. She built a quiet trap, and she kept it quiet, even from me, because she knew that if I knew about it, I might try to avoid it being triggered. She knew I would try to protect Trevor from himself, out of love for her. So she protected me from my own decency. That's a particular kind of love. The kind that thinks further ahead than you can see. The kind that trusts you enough to let you walk into the situation without a script and believes you'll do the right thing without knowing there's a right thing to do. I've thought about what I would say to Trevor if I ever had the chance to sit across from him again without lawyers in the room. I've thought about it for months. And what I've landed on is this: there's a difference between people who love you and people who love what they believe. They're owed by you. Your mother understood that difference with perfect clarity. She loved you enough to hope you'd be different than you were. But she loved me enough not to bet on it. I don't know if that's something Trevor will ever be able to hear. Some people can't hear the things that cost them too much to admit. But I've decided that's not my problem to carry. I have a house with good light in the mornings and a back porch, and a garden that needs work in the spring. And somewhere in the community center on Wednesday evenings, there's a brush I'm going to learn to hold a little more loosely. Dorothy would like that. I think she always liked it when I finally listened.